Good afternoon and welcome to Hope and Healing. My name is Jeff Friedman. We come to you on Creative Tucson every week and our main focus is on different issues in the realm of mental health. Each week we have a guest who has specific expertise in a particular area of mental health, and this week our guest is Elijah Oster, who is a lifespan psychiatric nurse practitioner. And he works primarily with a geriatric population. Elijah and I have been friends for, 17 years, 16 years, something like that.
Yeah.
And I knew you when, Elijah. You weren't so important.
Yep.
When I first met you.
Yeah, I was just a tech. That was
a Tech 2, right?
just a Tech 1 when we met.
A Tech 1, okay. Yeah. But I have to say this, that from the very beginning, I always thought of you as the most skillful. And I'm not trying to blow sunshine someplace, but we worked in a treatment center where some of the patients could be a little bit difficult.
Indeed, yeah.
And it took a lot of skill to be able to work with them effectively and successfully. And I can never remember a time when you took on a task that you weren't able to really do well with. And I used to rely on you.
Yeah, well, failure was never an option.
Well, that's
true. That made it easy.
That's true. That's true. You can't run home crying.
Yeah.
But it's wonderful that you worked hard and continued to pursue your goal, and now you're in a very highly skilled profession.
When I started at Cottonwood, I had just completed my bachelor's in psychology and family studies at the U of A. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to go on to social work or clinical psychology like my grandmother, or go into nursing like my mother, who's she's also a nurse practitioner, but she's a midwife. And so I thought I would work in the field and see what all those different aspects of sort of the psychology options were. And it became pretty clear pretty fast that nursing was the direction I wanted to go. They were just tough and highly skilled, and something about the nursing approach, there's just a real art to it. And I'm very happy with the decision, and the nurses sort of wouldn't let me make any other choice.
Yes, exactly.
Crushing me.
Once they get you in their clutches and you're a tech, you're going to end up with an RN at some point in your life.
We have mentored a lot of RNs from the tech staff,
yes.
And most of them did not start thinking they were going to be nurses. And
I think now 2 medical students from the tech staff as well, if yeah. not doctors. I don't know.
Yeah, I know Tanner is getting ready to finish medical school.
That's right. And then what was that guy's name? He was there with Tanner. But he ended up in medical school, I think, at UA too.
And we had one PsyD.
That's right, Paul Saito.
Paul went on to get a PsyD. But one thing that was a big eye-opener for me is that just the difference in turnover rate between the therapists who could have sort of a multiplicity of degrees between marriage and family therapy, or a master's in counseling and an MED.
Or social work and
right.
MSW.
And then, they would come in and, there would be a decrease in, the patient population, and they would just let them go. But the nurses were so hard to replace that once they got a good nurse, they wouldn't let go of them no matter what. So it was pretty clear to me that nursing was a more valuable way to go, and also a lot more flexible, because if you got tired of psychiatric nursing, you could go on to ICU.
Right. And when you were first in nursing school, was becoming a nurse practitioner part of the plan?
Not really. I was not planning that far ahead, but I think within a year of graduating from nursing school, I started talking with Tab.
Right.
And I just remember when I asked him.
Elijah's referring to a fellow named Tab Hoyt, who was a family nurse practitioner, and one of the doctors called him the font of all medical knowledge.
Yeah, he is still, even though I know a ton of physicians now, he's still one of the, and he was, of course, going to go to medical school. But he is just an excellent diagnostician and an excellent provider. And I asked him what he thought about me going on to be a nurse practitioner. And his answer was simply, well, do you want to take orders or give them? Mm-hmm. And he had a military background, and I went to a military school, so that language resonated with me quite a bit.
So tell the viewers exactly what a nurse practitioner is and does. I'm afraid some of the viewers may not know exactly.
So probably the main difference between a nurse practitioner and a physician in the United States, other than the educational requirements and probably the basic philosophy, is the difference between your scope of practice from state to state. So physicians in the United States all have pretty much the same scope of practice, but nurse practitioners, their scope of practice is very different depending on what state they practice in. So my brother lives in Georgia. In Georgia, a nurse practitioner cannot write a prescription for an aspirin without a physician signing off on that prescription. Whereas in Arizona, a nurse practitioner's scope of practice is close to identical. They do have to show that they have access to a physician within their specific specialty to give them direction. But other than that, they can practice independently, and they get reimbursed at approximately 85% of that of a physician. And then, of course, if you're a general practitioner, a family nurse practitioner, your scope is fairly broad. And if you're a specialist, like I'm a psychiatric, then you can only prescribe within your specific specialty. So.
But even a psychiatrist, it would raise eyebrows if they're prescribing outside of the scope of their professional practice.
A good psychiatrist probably wouldn't be trying to manage their patient's blood pressure. So I guess in that way it is fairly similar. It's just outlined more specifically for the nurse practitioners.
So in Arizona, you have a scope of practice that is very similar to a doctor in the same medical specialty. Yeah,
that's correct. The other difference is, our education is quite a bit different. My education path, I started off with a bachelor's in psychology, and I also got a lot of work on individual counseling, systems theory, human development in my minor. Then I went on to get an associate's degree in nursing, Then I worked as a nurse for over 2 years, and that was a requirement to get into my master's program. And then my master's program was a little over 3 years. So overall, in terms of years of education, it was probably fairly similar. But we also sort of have a different underlying philosophy. I would say nursing is much more patient-focused. Sometimes you think of physicians as being more disease-focused. But I received a lot of my training from physicians and psychiatrists, and I think they're just absolute assets, and I couldn't work without them.
So tell us a little bit about the nature of your practice. You focus more on older people.
So I would say probably 90% and possibly a little more of my population is people 65 and older. Probably 75% of that are people 80 or older. I see the vast majority of my patients either in their home, in assisted living, memory care, and skilled nursing facilities. So after I left Cottonwood, I worked for 2 years in a home health agency. And from there, I met several physicians who specialized in geriatric care. And it was something I'd always been interested in. And it was just an easy segue for me. I really liked the idea of seeing patients in their home. I worked in an office with another psychiatric nurse practitioner for a couple of years while I was getting my training done as part of my preceptorship. And I didn't like sitting in sort of the cubicle environment. Working at Cottonwood, we were constantly out, running around, putting out fires.
I think part of your job there was to wrangle rattlesnakes.
Yeah, absolutely. Rattlesnakes and round up javelinas. And I definitely like, moving around throughout the day. Sitting in one chair for, 8 to 12 hours was just never something it's really never something I did. All of my previous vocations had been, much more active than that. And I found that I would just kind of get, I guess, restless in that office type environment.
So can you tell us some of the issues that are common to people of advanced age, and what can you do to help?
So there's definitely some specific issues that I see in that population, and some that makes it pretty distinct from the general population. There's a lot of clinical depression. I would say probably a higher level of suicidality. And part of the aging process is, you suffer a lot of losses. I work with a lot of widows and widowers, a lot of people who are dealing with, the loss of loved ones, including the loss of children.
Right.
When you're 105 years old, it's not uncommon that you've survived one or more of your children. Yes. You also have the tremendous burden of physical disability, cardiac issues.
I'm sure pain as well.
Pain, dysfunction, the inability to walk and get around, the loss
isolation,
of vision and hearing is a tremendous burden that, I guess is obvious, but was not something that I immediately considered until I started working with the population. And then you have all the diseases. COPD is very common and causes a tremendous amount of anxiety. Parkinson's disease has a very high comorbidity with depression.
What about something like Alzheimer's? Is
Now,
there anything that you can do, or is it pretty much just?
There's a lot that I can do, and that's, I would say, a large percentage of my patients are dealing with some form of cognitive dysfunction. And so, I look at that as two very distinct categories. I have a segment of my patient population that has early cognitive decline. And they are trying to slow down the pace,
progression.
the progression.
So are there medications that can
There
be
are
used?
several. So you have.
Could you prescribe some for me?
Yeah. So you have Aricept, which a lot of people know about. And there are some new medications like memantine and galantamine that can slow down the progression of memory loss.
Of memory loss? How about with dementia?
And so that's the other population, is people who already have sort of advanced memory loss. And when you think of that population, you break that down into the two categories of with and without behavioral disturbance. So a lot of what I do is I help facilities and family members manage the behavioral disturbance that's really common with advanced dementia. And you can have things like aggressiveness. You also have a problem with safety risk. A lot of people will have executive dysfunction, and those, people who wander out into the street.
Okay.
And
yeah. And do you mainly treat with medication?
a lot of it is medication. A lot of it is staff education on non-pharmacological ways to redirect behaviors.
Right. Because I didn't think that you did the psychotherapy or the counseling. Or
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, you do that?
Yeah, I do a great deal of psychotherapy.
So you'll stop at a place and really do a session?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
So,
Okay.
you know, like I said, you have a lot of patients who are dealing with recent losses.
Yes.
You have patients who just are tired of living and want to die.
Right. Yeah.
You have patients who are dealing with severe anxiety, and that's, you know, another big issue. Cardiac disease.
Right.
That relationship between cardiovascular disease and depression is increasingly more obvious to everyone.
Right.
And, you know, we don't necessarily have causal linkage, but we have an excruciatingly high correlation. And if you can fix one, you know,
You
if you
might be
can
able to
reduce the
improve the other.
depression, you can definitely reduce the second heart
So-
attack.
Elijah, as someone who has done therapy with younger folks and now a geriatric population, is there a different approach that you must take with older people, or is it a similar approach?
So, you know, I was very much set on the idea that psychotherapy would be a major part of my practice. A lot of the, you know, I worked with some people who had either psychiatrists or other psychiatric nurse practitioners, and they had basically taken psychotherapy out of their practice because it just wasn't cost effective.
And so have a lot of psychiatrists, by the way.
Yeah. And it was always something that I wanted to do. And there is no doubt that medication can be effective at improving most psychiatric disorders. Talk therapy can be effective at improving most psychiatric disorders, but using both of them together is by far more effective than either one individually. And there's also some data showing that if the same person is providing both, that you have a better chance at improving symptom severity. So that's something that I wanted to do. And you know, I was doing psychotherapy with young adults, or you know, younger, not people under 65. And it was somewhat frustrating because a lot of them were, you know, very much causing a lot of their problems with just behavioral patterns.
Or unskillful attitudes, or bad relationships, or substance use.
Or, you know, and sometimes it was just, you know, economic issues that were outside of either of our control.
Right.
And, you know, we would work on things, and they would come back, you know, the next week, and they wouldn't have implemented, you know, any of the strategies, and of course they would be shocked that, you know, things weren't getting any better for them. And, you know, it's like, well, if you keep hitting yourself in the head with a ball peen hammer, you're going to continue to come to our sessions with a headache. And I have found it much easier to sort of affect change with my elderly patients. And I think that's just because the problems that they're suffering from seem much more external.
Yes, and certainly not as a result of something that they're doing wrong.
Yeah, and so I even, you know, in a way that even makes it that much easier to have 100% empathy, and just really, you know, be that much more engaged in improving the situation for them.
Well, you know, if you can't manage empathy, you can usually fake empathy.
Right. Well, and I think at Cottonwood, you know, so many of our patients were the cause of their own problems.
Right.
And I know for a fact that, you know, one of our primary interactions as colleagues was, you know, basically blowing off steam because we were basically at sympathy burnout. Yeah. And with this population, it's just not something that I have.
Well, when we would interact, when we were working back there, usually what started that interaction was some kind of crisis or bad behavior. Problematic behavior that was getting on someone's nerves, probably the nurses. And you would be dispatched to sort of put out the fire, and then you would find out that I was responsible for this particular person, and you'd walk them up to my office. And usually, by the time they got to my office, they were pretty calm and ready to listen.
Yeah.
And in a short walk, maybe 150 feet, you could do that. And so you said, even though a lot of nurse practitioners have taken psychotherapy out of their practice, you made sure that you were going to keep it in your practice. And I think, you know, from my perspective, it's because you like to do it. And I think the reason you like to do it is because you have a natural knack for it.
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
You had before you went to the University of Arizona, and they taught you all of that stuff. I had a clinical director at my first job that said, look, either you can do this or you can't. And if you can't, no amount of training is going to enable you to be good at this.
Yeah. So, one of the first, major studies that you end up looking at is the one that correlates success at therapy with basically the patients, how much they like their therapist.
The quality of the relationship.
The rapport.
Yeah.
And one of my, a good friend and an excellent ally in my nurse practitioner program, he had already had a PhD in psychology with advanced training in psychotherapy and real, Freudian psychodynamic therapy.
Really?
But, as much as I liked him, he was probably a little bit difficult to like. And, he would talk to me a lot about his difficulty in connecting with his patients. And I'm like, well, I don't find that surprising.
Yeah. Unfortunately.
Yeah. So, a lot of it is about, building that therapeutic alliance and then convincing, the patient that it's in their best interest to get better. And,
Right.
Creating that relationship with, the best parts of that person and strengthening it, through
Exactly.
the almost classic sort of cognitive behavioral therapy. Is bringing out their best.
I've always believed that if you want to create the best therapeutic alliance, number one, you have to make sure that the patient understands that he's in pain or she's in pain.
Yeah.
You have to get that down first. And I agree with you that the sickest person, the most dysfunctional person, has islands of good health that we can add sand to.
Absolutely. Yeah, so, Carl Rogers was a huge influence on my early psychology. And unconditional positive regard is I guess the easiest way to describe his overall approach. And Al Bandura, who uses social cognitive therapy, is a lot about modeling and being a role model and exhibiting the sort of characteristics that your patient would benefit from having himself.
Yeah.
And I sort of kind of blended those two together. And so you want to have that positive, unconditional positive regard, and you want to model these kind of positive traits that you want your patients to also be expressing. But I think the other important part is, there is that unconditional positive regard, but it's also finding those parts of the patient that you want to amplify.
Exactly.
And, sort of separating out their strengths and allowing those to flourish. And almost sort of, dissecting away the parts that just aren't helpful to them.
Well, with the population that you deal with, you're working with people who are closing in on the end of their life.
Yeah.
And they've lived long lives. And many of them, I bet you, are very accomplished people.
Oh, yeah.
Who have done things that you or I just could never approach. Maybe some World War II veterans.
Absolutely.
And people who had built companies and had fine professional careers and great accomplishments. And now they're weak, they're in pain, they're grieving, they're depressed. And so I can imagine that the unconditional positive regard with this particular population probably comes a little bit easy.
Yeah, and that's sort of what I was saying about the sympathy burnout. It's very easy for me to develop that just a great deal of respect and basically love for this population.
Yeah.
And I mean, the amount of impressive people, and of course at Cottonwood, I think we had a benefit of working with people that were, very impressive. Most of them were, very high IQ and very accomplished. But, some of the patients that I'm working with, on their yay me wall is them with, every president since Gerald Ford.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and not to mention, although I may have run out of World War II vets, they're getting more and
I
more
suppose.
scathed.
Yeah.
But when I started, I still had quite a few, and now we're sort of moving into Korea, and rapidly it's, sliding into Vietnam.
Vietnam is coming pretty quickly.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
I'm just glad that I got in when I did, because I think probably the greatest generation was really, where I wanted to be working
Yes,
when I first
and you got a
in.
chance to.
Absolutely.
And I think if we're open to it, we will get such an education from talking to older people, and even an inspiration
Yeah.
from talking to them.
Yeah, and the patients that I'm working with, they lived in a country where, there was still, it's like the feuds in the backwoods, and if a cop came out to try to, put, the legal system to work, they would strip the cop naked, tie him up, put him in the back of the truck, and drop him off in the middle of town. It was, these people have a very different experience
Yes.
than the world that my children are going to grow up in, where, the speech on the internet is controlled. They still lived in a country where, murder was still something that was fairly commonly not something that the
Reported.
police even
would hear about.
dealt with.
Yeah. And it's also a time when a very large segment of the United States population had no opportunity, or very little opportunity.
Well, I'm not sure about, well, possibly, but they certainly dealt with a much more intensive level of difficulty, and suffering through the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And
then this
the
Great
wars.
War. Yeah.
And so these people definitely had trials by fire. And I see it in their characters. And, I still have quite a few patients that are, younger, baby boomers and, people of Generation X. And, they have a very different life experience than my older patients.
And I wonder if they don't also suffer, but just differently and with different causes.
Oh, sure. Oh, absolutely. That's the thing about suffering. And I learned that at Cottonwood. So we had patients there who, were billionaires.
Right.
And, when they described their life, it was like, this is a life that most people would only dream of having.
Yes.
And they were absolutely miserable and
Dissatisfied.
abject pain.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, that subjective experience of dissatisfaction, depression, anxiety, has nothing to do with what your actual life is like.
It'll surprise you.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
And that was also an excellent way to start off my education.
Yeah.
With mental health, is realizing
Yes.
that, you can pour $1 billion on the problem and you're not
Right.
going to fix anything. And of course, we've seen, so many of our patients commit suicide, through the media, and, it's heartbreaking.
It is. Heartbreaking is the word for it. Another thing that was really interesting to me, and it has nothing to do with what we should be talking about right now. But we used to get our share of supermodels at this place. And I can't remember a single one of them who didn't have great insecurity about her looks.
Right.
Can you imagine? And so the number one, to me, a person's suffering, their internal emotional state, will surprise you sometimes. And I think the lesson here is don't take anything for granted.
Yeah.
Ask questions, probe.
And, you know, the literature on this is very clear. Basically, once you reach about $50,000 a year, which basically puts you in the middle class, maybe even lower middle class in the United States, money's ability to impact your statistical experience of happiness is...
It starts to lose its power.
No, it completely
it
goes
does.
to zero.
Okay.
So, you know, moving from 40,000 to 50,000, there's a good chance that you will have an incremental increase in happiness or decrease in,
right, but after
depression
50,000,
after 50,000, after your basic needs are met,
right.
money's ability to impact happiness becomes zero. And, you know, that was the other thing. You know, the supermodels are worried about their looks, and, you know, the millionaires are worried about their money. So, you know, it's not always obvious how to fix your problems.
It's true.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit more about some of the unusual conditions that you run into. Dementia is probably common, the cognitive decline, common, grief, depression, pain. What are some of the things that are a little bit...
So, you know, funnily enough, or if that's the right way to describe it, you know, working in a typical adult population, of course, you have quite a few of your patients are going to be suffering from schizophrenia, bipolar, schizoaffective disorder.
Now, the schizophrenia, can that flower in late in life?
I've seen one patient diagnosed with schizophrenia, and I believe it was diagnosed at a psychiatric hospital here. And I didn't believe it for a millisecond. There's
Really?
I haven't even read a single case study where you had somebody develop schizophrenia after the age of 65.
Really?
So generally, you know, when I see that, I immediately think, you know, either delirium or, you know, some kind of infection, neurotoxic effect, unrecognized stroke. But, you know, I do have some schizophrenics or schizoaffective patients who have, and the thing is that most of them just don't survive to be 85 years old. And the ones that have are really interesting and some of my most fun patients.
And so somebody with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, why won't they live past 85? Is it that they're not able to nourish themselves well?
Well, I would say the easiest way to say it is that statistically they just don't.
That's interesting.
And why they don't, there's probably a lot of reasons. So, you know, you have higher suicide risk. Okay. You have higher smoking rates.
Okay,
you have poor nutrition, decreased amount of exercise, the fact that the medications that they require to manage those symptoms
can be kind of toxic.
Are, you know, right? I mean, you have a side effect list as long as you're right. So, you know, there's so many factors that it's hard to say what's causing it, but I'm sure they all stack up.
You know, it's interesting. I've worked with very few schizophrenics over the years, but I never knew one who didn't smoke.
And
Never-
when I started working with schizophrenics, one of the things that they did, the actual hospital purchased tobacco.
Yeah.
And, they would provide the patients with cigarettes if they couldn't afford it. And the truth is that nicotine seems to be, very helpful
Really?
at helping manage their symptoms.
I think a long time ago, and this was in the bad old days, that they used to give cigarettes as incentive or to reward pro-social behavior
Yeah.
in the facilities.
Yeah, and there's some argument about whether it's useful just because of using sort of behavioral theory, or just a simple Skinner approach. People like smoking, and if you give them cigarettes, they will be less likely to engage in antisocial behavior, or whether or not nicotine itself
Calms
helps
them down.
them regulate the neurotransmitters in some sort of a positive way.
Well, it's a dopamine pump.
Yeah. So, but if you ask a schizophrenic, they'll tell you, I feel better after I smoke.
Right.
And of course, yeah, I guess the schizophrenic patients that I have smoke, and they're pretty much the only ones.
But that makes a lot of sense. That would chop a few years off anyone's life,
Yeah.
And especially if they're heavy smokers, and so many of them are just real heavy smokers.
Yeah.
They chain them off.
I would say it's by far the single most, dangerous thing that you can purposefully do is smoke cigarettes. Other than playing in traffic perhaps, but modifiable behaviors, smoking is a huge one.
Yeah. And again, one of the legal drugs. You look at tobacco and alcohol, and
I
ask
think
any cop.
alcohol is number 2.
What's the cause of most of your calls?
Yeah.
And it has something to do with somebody drunk or
Yeah.
has been drinking.
So, and that's, I still get to work with, some patients with alcohol disorders.
Mm-hmm.
A big part is trying to figure out whether or not the patient is suffering from dementia or delirium.
Right.
I've had quite a few patients who I got referred to with a diagnosis of dementia. And after interviewing them and working with them for a while, it became pretty clear that, at the very least, the way they were expressing their symptoms of dementia were very atypical, which made me suspicious. And then, if working with the physician and working them up for various, other issues, oftentimes you are able to find a reversible cause of delirium, and the dementia either got a lot better or just went away completely.
And that's because they were abusing alcohol?
No, infections.
Oh, I see.
Pain.
Okay. Right.
A lot of different things. They could be having bad reactions to medications.
And another thing about medication, that someone with dementia or memory problems who's living alone might inadvertently misuse medications that would either disinhibit them or make them confused or make it look like they're suffering from a delirium.
Yeah, and that's that's a big part of what I do is working with patients who are either living alone, and it's becoming increasingly clear to the family, to the medical team, or even to the patient, that it's no longer really safe. Or working with patients who have already just recently lost their independence and are trying to get used to living in a domiciliary environment, and that's tough.
Is it tough to access those resources?
Well, as far as that goes, you know, I think, you know, my generation is probably going to be in real trouble because they're very expensive.
But for you, if you need to place somebody in a supportive environment of one kind or another, you're able to do it? Or?
Yeah, but I mean, and of course that got increasingly better, you know, as I continued to work in the field.
Right.
And my network of professionals expanded.
Okay.
And, you know, now I have quite a lot of resources to help people with that transition.
You support single payer insurance?
So that's an interesting question. And, you know, right now I have two types of patients. I have patients who are on traditional Medicare, and I have patients who pay cash.
Mm-hmm.
So the only patients that I work with are sort of in the American version of single payer. And now there's a tremendous number of options, what they call advantage plans. And, you know, these are people who qualify for Medicare. They can now, instead opt to get a more traditional corporate insurance plan.
And isn't that like an add-on to the Medicare Part B?
Well,
or is it like a different choice?
I think how a lot of these people are getting, a lot of these advantage plans are getting their customers is actually by undercutting the cost of Medicare. And, you know, they do this by having very small networks. So it tremendously decreases the patient's access to which physicians they want to see. And then, you know, they make the providers jump through a tremendous number of hurdles with what types of care they can get. So Medicare spends 3% of their budget on administrative costs.
Good.
And say a Blue Cross Blue Shield or a United, they spend between 15 and 20% of their budget on administrative costs. And that extra money is primarily spent, in my opinion, creating barriers between the patient and the medical care.
Yeah.
And, you know, somehow they think that's a good thing.
Well, they are paying nurses and social workers good money to deny care.
Yeah.
And so that's some of the administrative costs, because nurses don't come cheap.
Yeah.
And social workers are not cheap either, I guess. They don't make as much as nurses.
And they probably make more working for insurance companies than they would in most of their...
Can you imagine what a nasty job that is?
It probably depends on the person. If it's somebody who wants to sit in that desk, you know, then they probably like it quite a bit. You know, and if right, not everybody has that clinical compassion.
No, you're right, and I'm going to leave it there because I'm in danger of going off on a rant.
Yeah.
And actually, that's what this show is eventually going to turn into.
Yeah.
But
I remember reading an article against single-payer healthcare, and it was specifically against Medicare for all. And after reading that article, I said, you know, here's the strongest argument I can come up with for a single-payer system. Mm-hmm. Because their arguments were just such straw men and just terrible. Now, as a provider, although I work with Medicare, and I think it's a wonderful system, and one of my good friends who also works is a geriatric specialist, has recently taken on several of the new Advantage plans. And, you know, within, you know, 8 or 9 months of working with him, now, you know, every time I go to the office, you know, he's cussing because there are just, more and more barriers to care
Yeah.
for his patients, more and more refusals to pay, and it's just,
And
it's not something that I would want to deal with.
And it becomes a low common denominator all across the board because
Yeah.
clinicians, who's going to put up with that system except someone who maybe can't get into another panel?
Yeah.
And so who
Well,
knows
that's,
what you're going
that's
to
sort of the problem. And then, what they do is they make you, hire more personnel
Yeah,
just to deal with the vomit of paperwork
exactly.
that they, send your way to prevent you from providing the care that the patient needs. And, then over time, the amount of money that you're paid, per visit or per patient is going to stagnate, while the cost of your overhead is going to go up. A $15 minimum wage, or whatever it happens to be, is going to go up a lot faster than what these insurance companies are going to pay you. And when I have tried to credential with some of these Advantage plans, even though they've had substantially ineffective numbers of psychiatric providers for their panel, have still tried to pay me a fraction.
Yeah.
Yeah. In order to then make me jump through all kinds of hoops to service their clientele.
Yeah, and so imagine who would say yes to all of that.
Well, the thing is that most people don't know. And,
that's true.
The people who move on to these sort of disadvantaged plans have no idea what they're getting into.
What I was referring to is the people who will hire on to these panels,
Right.
the professional people. Since 2013, I've gotten my health care through the VA. Now, this is government health care, and I've never been happier. Every interaction, and I would like to say this because the VA gets some bad press, and I've never had a bad experience with the VA. And recently I needed to have surgery, and because it was surgery on my spine, it was neurosurgery, and because the VA could not accommodate me within 30 days, they're required to send me to community-based resources and pay for it. Mm-hmm. So I went to UMC. I'll say it right on the air. I've never had a worse experience than I had at UMC. It was terrible. The nurses were horrible.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I have spent a lot of time at UMC in clinical rotations, and the majority of their nurses, at least at that time, were travelers, because they didn't want to raise the amount of money they were willing to pay
And
local
now
nurses,
and now
but they would
Banner's
pay
taken it over.
twice as much, to somebody who would work there for 2 months
Right.
and fly in from Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And I certainly don't want to make any blanket statements, but in my experience, travelers aren't as necessarily as committed to providing good service.
And Elijah, you did those rotations before Banner came into town.
Yeah, it was right about the time that switched over.
Yeah. And it's taken a turn for the worst, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and I do have a lot of friends who work there. Mm-hmm. And I've heard good and bad things about it. But.
Well, I don't want to, and I did. I'm sort of painting them with a broad brush, but this was my experience. At least the people I work with, it just left a lot to be desired. And
yeah, but and that's, if you said, what is your primary, goal with any patient that I have? That answer is simple: keep them out of the hospital. Yeah. Because, hospitals are just excruciatingly dangerous places to go.
And very unpleasant places to be. And that's not just for UMC, but And I've been hospitalized at the VA for an operation, and I hate it. They treated me like gold. They were wonderful people, but I mean, who needs to be in an uncomfortable bed with lines in both arms? And every time your bag empties, it's like this beeper goes off that's so loud.
Yeah, they're very dehumanizing.
Ugh.
You know, I mean, and you know, you can't sleep, and you know, you don't eat, and
Right.
you know, and that's one of the things I love about, you know, home care, and you know, there's something about being in your own space is good for people. And
Yes.
you know, when I'm
Exactly.
working with the elderly, you know, it is so common for them to come back home after a hospitalization or rehabilitation experience, you know, and they've lost
Really.
a tremendous amount of cognitive capacity.
Oh,
And
that's so
whether or
sad.
not they get it back
Yeah.
is really dependent on my skill.
Oh, okay.
And
Okay.
you know, and that's, you know, a huge thing, is helping people get back those cognitive skills before they're gone forever. 'Cause so often as your memory is falling apart, you know, you use environmental cues to help you fabricate a
Yeah.
believable
Yes.
persona.
Right.
And so a lot of times the
Yeah.
family members don't even notice that, you know, their mom or dad or grandmother is, you know, really starting to have significant memory loss and cognitive decline.
So you're saying that if a person has been hospitalized and they suffer a setback cognitively because of the hospitalization, if you are able to get in there quickly and work skillfully, you can get some of it or all of it back for them?
That's often the case, yeah.
That's very
And so
interesting.
what will often happen is, you know, people will go, you know, they were completely fine, and then they had a fall,
Yeah,
or this happened, and they came back, and now they, you know, I don't even recognize them. They're like a
Yeah.
completely different person. And so they think it's sudden onset, you know, a sudden change. And, you know, I have to explain to them, well, it's possible. There's also a high likelihood that this has been pernicious.
Right.
Only they have been able to mask the symptoms by creating routines and using environmental cues
What's wrong with that?
to put together this sort of,
Yeah.
you know, characterization that everything is just fine.
But that's
And then
not
you
necessarily a
separate
bad thing,
them
right?
from those environmental cues.
Yeah, and then they lose it.
And they lose it.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you can get back in there right away, develop a good rapport, and then help them knit it back
Right.
together before it's gone forever, then you can help them recover quite a bit. And, you know, if that doesn't happen, then, you know, it's unlikely that they will improve. That's been my experience. And so, you know, oftentimes people think I'm like a miracle worker, but it's just, you know, understanding sort of what's happening and
Well,
what steps you can take to improve.
You know what, Elijah,
situation.
they think you're a miracle worker, but really you just are doing what you have been doing ever since I met you, just with a different population.
Well, you know, what are you good at? You're good at what you do every day.
Oh, sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and of
I
course, you're
think-
probably doing what you do every day because you're good at it. Maybe that's.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you're connecting with people like you connected with people when I first met you.
Okay.
And that was the nice thing. You didn't come and tell people, you didn't get lost in your own agenda. You would listen skillfully and talk skillfully. And that makes all the difference, whether you're doing it with a 19-year-old or you're doing it with an 85-year-old. If you can connect, you can connect. If you can't connect, you can't connect.
Yeah. And, you know, once I started prescribing medications, and as a lifespan nurse practitioner, there's, two possible psychiatric degrees for a nurse practitioner. You can either adult only or a lifespan, and that basically just means that you can also work with children, adolescents. Generally as a nurse practitioner, we prefer to work with kids, age 7 and up.
Mm-hmm.
Although, I don't think that's formally articulated anywhere.
But it's so rare that someone would have a psychiatric disorder or be diagnosed with psychiatric below that age, and even rare.
Right. But, of course, nowadays, right after the age of 7, it's like, suddenly 68% of all the male students in a classroom have attention deficit disorder.
That's a scandal.
So, and that's what I had to deal with, when I was doing my preceptorship with, children and adolescents. I was just, I couldn't morally figure out how I would engage in that. And, and then you're prescribing these kids, medications that we were talking about the schizophrenic patients and what's one of the possible causes for their, early death rates. And, I don't want to put a 9-year-old on Risperdal because, he won't pay attention in math class.
Well, the differential diagnosis to that is they're a 7-year-old.
Right, or they're,
Okay.
maybe they're boys.
Yeah.
Which was, unfortunately, in terms of children that age, probably was like 85% of the population. And once you got into adolescence, then there were, it was more equitable.
It is, well, once a person passes puberty, the entire hormonal structure is different.
Yeah.
And so many of these disorders are based on some dysregulation of neurotransmitters, many of which are hormones.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is especially true in females. So to find a depressed 7-year-old girl is very hard. To find a depressed 14-year-old is extremely easy.
Right. And so, one of the things is that temperament is very sex-based. And, neuroticism, which is, one of the big 5 personality traits, basically is fairly equivalent to anxiety and depression. And, females just have a much higher rate of high neuroticism.
And much more, or a different hormonal profile.
Yeah. Well,
than boys.
you can't really separate those two things out.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Elijah, I am so grateful that we had a chance to spend time with each other. And thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
It was great, Jeff. It was great.
Well, it's been great for us too. I hope to have you back again. So I also want to thank our viewers today for tuning in to Hope and Healing. And we will see you again next week.